to hand it over and introduce today's speaker, author, and character, by the way, Peter Kozodoy, to talk about honesty and all its virtues. So welcome, Peter.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah, no, I'm glad you all had me. And as I was telling you earlier, one of my whole chapters is, based on conscious capitalism, and an interview from Alex McCoben. So, honesty and being conscious actually has a lot to do with one another.
So the book took you 4 years to produce. Was there any particular profound milestones in that process, and what were they?
I mean, for me, first of all, the thing about writing a book about honesty is I get to be honest, for better or worse. I never set out to write a book about honesty or speak about honesty or frankly even care about honesty. I sat down to write a marketing book, what I thought would be a marketing book. And it was born out of two things that came together when tragedy struck and a horrible thing happened to me, which is that I turned 30. Glenn, I don't know if this has happened to you or not, or any of you out there. It's terrible. I don't recommend it for anyone. I mean, it was just a really tough time in my life. And a couple of things came together. One is on the business side, I had been working with clients for years, from startups to the Fortune 500 and even Warren Buffett himself. And I was always frustrated by the fact that our clients fell into two camps. In one camp, we would go into companies and get into their frontline employees and customers and unearth all these insights and information. We'd give them back to the executive team, say, here's who you are, here's what you need to do. And they would say, okay, great, let's do it. And they would just get explosive results with us. They would stay for years and be happy. And other clients we took on did the same work, went into their frontline employees, customers, here's the insights, here's the information, here's what we need to do. And they would just blow up. They descended into infighting and politics and bullshit. And I was like, well, I spent my elective courses in undergrad going to the business school there at Brandeis, eventually got an MBA from Columbia. They don't talk about what happens when a leader abandons logic in favor of ego. That's not a class. So I was sort of flabbergasted by that. And at the same time, as I turned 30, I had to face two giant failures that I had endured as a teenager. One is I was convinced I was going to the Olympics as a figure skater. I was a very serious skater, trained for 15 years, on the path. And the other was I was convinced I was going to Harvard. I grew up outside of Boston. There was only one school. I had several family members go. I was going. By 18, it was clear that neither one of those things was going to happen. And it was a devastating time. And actually, it took me until 30, to that moment you asked about, Glenn, to have to get honest with myself personally about, who I was and what my big goals still were and why I had sort of abandoned the first best version of myself. And that's when all of this crystallized into what I thought was a marketing book, about my frustrations about marketing. And it was my agent who said, this actually is a book about honesty. And I was like, well, clearly you can't read because it doesn't say anything about honesty on the front page. And of course he was right, upon further reflection. And so I am quite surprised that I am the one to be, the author of a book called Honest to Greatness. It certainly was not planned. And yet here I am. So I guess it was a string of moments that came together.
You and I are both in the same business in terms of branding and marketing, which is a category that's not known for its honesty. Is there any kind of relationship there in terms of the professional work and the integrity of that?
Yeah, huge. And I want to make a very important point. The book came out August 11th. I was very fortunate. It premiered #1 in a couple categories on Amazon. One of those categories was business ethics. But this is not an ethics book, right? I think people should be ethical and honest, like as a core value. I think that's nice. That's not what this is. This is a how to achieve the shit you want to achieve in life and in business book. And by the way, honesty is the way to do it. And that, back to my stories, like I didn't intend to write a book about honesty. That's where all these stories and case studies led me. One of the first case studies I tell in part 2, Glenn, is about Charlotte McCourt, a little 11-year-old Girl Scout who wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies, right, as they all do. But this little Girl Scout had a feeling that the Girl Scouts of America sometimes used false advertising. And she didn't want her customers to fall into any traps. So she made herself a little letter, wrote a letter with a guide to every cookie rated on a scale of 0 to 10 with a little description. Some she rated a 10, said, hey, buy these, they're delicious. Others she rated a 0 and a 1, calling one cookie a gluten-free wasteland. And, because she was so brutally honest, and she handed this letter to her couple of friends and family customers, they found it refreshing. We have this phrase in the English language, refreshingly honest, for a reason, and they shared it, and they shared it until she was eventually on national television. Charlotte sold 30,000 boxes of Girl Scout cookies by telling people the truth about which ones are great and which ones were not. And we've all had this experience, right? We've all had the salesperson experience where they say, I should probably sell you the more expensive thing here, but if you package it this way and you add this and that, you'll get the same benefits and it'll actually be a little cheaper. And you're like, oh, cool, wow, cool. Like, thank you for saying that. That's wonderful. That is, listen, we operate in a very different environment today than we did 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, right? We were talking about this before the call started. It's like conscious capitalism is only a decade old. We're all thinking about this. Why? Because we can all see things as they happen. We're seeing with our own eyes all of these scandals come to light. It's very difficult to hide the truth in the super transparent environment that we live in today, which, by the way, is more transparent than it has been in the history of humans on Earth, right? We can see stuff with our own eyes. In that environment, it doesn't pay to do anything but be honest and transparent, which is why companies now, the ones I profile in my book, from the Ritz-Carlton to Quicken Loans, to Domino's Pizza, to Connecticut's own Bridgewater Associates, they're able to use honesty as a strategy that achieves results. I firmly believe as we move further and further into information ubiquity and transparency, companies are going to be forced to be honest whether they want to or not. It is now in this moment that companies can still get ahead of that wave and actually use it to drive results. It's still refreshing now.
And it's also a commodity that's become kind of scarce in civil discourse, right? Many examples of civil leadership now that is pretty much needs to read your book. It seems to be somewhat compromised these days. So in some ways, your book is very timely.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what we need to define honesty first before we assign it to anyone, right? So, let's spend a little while doing that. And it's actually helpful to figure out what honesty is not before we figure out what it is. One of the great CEOs in my book that I interviewed makes a good point. He says, if you're flying in an airplane and the pilots come over the intercom and they say, well, folks, we've never seen storm clouds like that before. Please put your seatbelts on. I'm not quite sure if we're going to be able to land this thing, but we're going to do our best. Is it honest? Yeah, but is it helpful? Not really, right? Honesty is only as good as the trust that it creates. And we've all seen the movie where someone knows something and they don't tell the main character, and the main character finds out later and they get upset about it. Why couldn't you just be honest? Now, on the flip side, how many of you are parents? Do we have parents in the audience? It's probably a bad idea to just tell your kids the entire truth all the time, no matter what, right? Probably not a good parenting strategy. So, as I kind of run through those scenarios, now honesty takes on a nuance, right? And honesty could mean at many different times transparency, like we talked about, authenticity, willing to admit fault, ready for change, all of these things. I stratify it into a framework in the book called the hourglass of honesty. And it starts with 3 levels. The first level is getting honest about what I call the community. In other words, what's happening in society at large. 2020 is a very juicy year for this, right? We have global pandemic, we have racial injustice issues, we have gender bias, gender fluidity, things that we weren't even thinking about, right? Just a few years ago. We operate in these environments. We need to be aware of them. We cannot put our heads in the sand and pretend they don't exist, or pretend that we can cling to the status quo as a way to move forward. It doesn't work that way. The second level is getting honest with and about the others around you. And this is where we can perhaps use this as a framework to assess, what does honesty really mean? Because sometimes we do need to be honest with people, right? We need to level with them. I tell the story of Domino's Pizza in part 2 of the book, and how when they figured out their customers didn't like their pizza very much, they didn't just go change their crust. They went on national TV and said, hey, America, we're really sorry, but our pizza apparently is terrible, and we're going to fix it. And we want to invite you in to see so you can see for yourself how we're fixing it. You come into the kitchen. They put out videos of them looking at the recipe and fixing it. They put out videos of them going to people's homes, giving them a piece of pizza. Hey, do you like this better? What do you think? Sometimes we do need to be honest with people. Other times we need to be honest about them, about their ego, about their biases, about their beliefs or self-limiting beliefs, about how they may act and react. This is where empathy comes into play. This is why you don't just tell your kids anything that's on the top of your head, because you're honest about them and you have, hopefully, their best interest at heart. Now, that's only a problem when it comes back to that word trust, because if people find out later and they get pissed off, then we've probably made a mistake in honesty. But if people find out later that you were lying and they say, you know what, I could see why you did that. It's probably in my best interest. Whether they agree with it or not, those kinds of conversations happen in our minds. Now, each one of you pegs the word honesty as a value in your core values somewhere or other, right? Maybe at the top, maybe at the bottom, may not even be on the list at all. And I talk a lot about core values in the book because we spend so much time thinking about core values in the context of a corporation, so little time thinking about them in the context of our lives. And yet, if you can understand your values, not only that, but the order in which your values appear, you can explain probably 98% of all the conflict that you have in the workplace, with other people, with your spouse, hopefully not, I didn't say it. But it really comes back to that. And here's what's interesting, right? If you look at my core values hierarchy, right? Service actually comes above honesty. So what that means is if I'm putting in a position where to protect someone else, I have to lie, I will make that trade. Whereas someone with those same values in the reverse order would never even consider it because honesty comes first. These are really important for us to grapple with, because if we can look at the world and the others around us in the lens of what do we actually believe, right? What are our core values? We can get very honest about why people do things, what their motivations might be, whether their intentions were good or not. Honesty is a lens. You know, that's really what I hope people take away from reading the book, is that they see the world now in how honest or not is this thing I'm looking at. And the final level, Glenn, before I turn it back to you, is honest with and about the self, with and about the self. And this is where we need to do our best to understand our own ego and biases and self-limiting beliefs. The prevailing assumptions we make and that we hold within ourselves, that we make decisions on, that sometimes are not even true. I've coached hundreds of entrepreneurs. I have several clients every month, and it is like clockwork. An entrepreneur will tell me, well, Peter, yeah, I want to go that way and I want to do that, but I can't do that until I do this. And I'm like, well, who told you that? Like, well, how is that related to this? That's just something you think is true. It's not even true, right? We've got to unlearn that. And that's where honesty about the self comes in. And that's what I've found, is that people and organizations that get honest on all three levels, what happens is they're fundamentally changed. Like Glenn, honest Glenn is different than dishonest Glenn, right? You know, honest Glenn has different hopes, fears, dreams, aspirations. And in that moment that you're able to become the honest version of yourself, what naturally happens is you change the others around you. If you're an organization, that could be your employees, your customers, your vendors, your suppliers. As a person, your friends, sometimes your family. Maybe you cut out great Aunt Millie because, you know, she's not contributing to your life. And once we change the circle around us, that's how the leaders and organizations in my book have bent the community towards them and created industry dominating success.
I have a question. So are you familiar, obviously you know a little about Ray Dalio and his thing. Have you also, are you familiar with Amy Edmonton and psychological safety?
I am not, but I talk a lot about psychological safety in the book, so. Yeah,
so you're probably on the same thing. So she's a Harvard professor, but she writes about.
That's okay, nobody's perfect. Keep going.
Yeah, no, and yeah. And so, you know, and so like what she says from, you know, and I guess when you talk about honesty, I keep going around the same kind of thing, thinking like, yeah, it's all the same ball of wax. So, because what Amy Edmonton talks about is that, you know, to create psychological safety, in a workplace so that people can freely talk about, what's going on and what needs to happen. The leader needs to show that they're vulnerable. So the leader needs to be able to say, look, I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers. I need your guys' help. And the leader also needs to bring their whole quirky self to work and be who they really are. Because when they do that, then they're giving everybody else permission to, bring their whole selves to work and also say, I don't know the answer to this either. I got this part of my job that I'm supposed to be doing, but I don't get it. And if the leader can admit that they don't know what's going on or what's really happening, then, everybody else can start to do that too. So, so that's what she's sort of framing that up. And a lot of her work was in hospital situations and nursing floors and, and comparing so one group of nurses maybe, had reported very few mistakes, another group reported many more mistakes, but in reality, the group that reported very few mistakes actually made many more, but they were too afraid to report them, that kind of thing. And of course, you're not going to get things fixed. You're not going to, face, what needs to happen. And, going back to your initial thing, about like those leadership teams that you would talk to and say, hey, this is what needs to be done. And they'd go like, oh yeah, that's totally it. And they would just go and they would do it. And then the other ones would be like, no, it's not, that's not us. That's not who we are. That's not what's going on. And all this fighting and, distrust and everything. And what I really love about the, Ray Dalio's thing is he sort of takes that whole thing one more level. And he says, basically, if you have a concern, if there's something that you're worried about, that concern doesn't belong to you. That concern belongs to the group and you have to share it. So that sort of really, so now if you're a person in Bridgewater and you've got a concern, you feel really free to bring it up because your boss just told you that belongs to the group and you have to share it. So that's again, a psychological safety, but it's kind of like, it's also a big part of honesty then, because then, I'm really going to share, what's really going on in my head and what I'm really thinking about and being much more honest about, everything essentially.
No, you're 100% right, Gavin. And a few years ago, I was in the underbelly of Times Square. I was writing for Inc. magazine. I was there to interview Bethany Frankel, which for those of you who don't know, she was a housewife in New York, and eventually grew a 9-figure alcohol brand and exited that. And of course, I love alcohol, so I was very interested in the whole story. And so I'm interviewing her, and she's telling me how one of her secrets to success is that she's just extremely honest about what she doesn't know. And she's obsessed with this power that ignorance has. And so I'm listening to her, taking notes. 20 minutes later, she goes on stage. I walk out to the audience to watch. And sure enough, she's up there, and one of the ad execs said a term she didn't know. She stopped the presses, like stood up, like, everybody stop, hold on. I don't know what that means. Tell me what that means. Yeah. Now, just imagine how smart you could become in life if you go around saying, like, I have no idea. Teach me, tell me, show me. I don't know. And in fact, that is a unique trait that weaves through every CEO in my book, from the head of the Ritz-Carlton, Quicken Loans, Ray Dalio, who literally writes on the first page of his book, I'm a dumb shit. Like, this is the trait. Get honest about what you don't know, because that blind spot is so big in all of us that if we don't get honest about that it's there, how big it is, and what might be in it, we're just going to keep walking around without knowing the things that we need to know in order to capitalize on what's ahead. Now, in practice, take Quicken Loans, right, which just went public under ticker RKT. But at the time I interviewed Jay Farner, their CEO, they were still private. And they have a very strict code of conduct that they call their isms. And it's a set of rules that governs how they behave. More than a culture code, it's really what they believe. One of their isms is it's not about who is right, it's about what is right. And another one that I absolutely love is say yes before no. Say yes before no. How different is that from most companies, right? So when you ask a question like, and this is what I ended up, coming into the interview, like, how did you develop Rocket Mortgage, which is the digital app that you can get a mortgage on? Why do we need to kill a stack of paper when we could just do it on our phone? I don't know. I feel that way about voting too, by the way. Phone knows who I am. Don't know why we can't figure that out. Aside. And, I wanted to know why they invented Rocket Mortgage and not their much bigger publicly traded mortgage providers like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and so on. And it shot Quicken Loans to the #1 spot. Okay. So what I ended up figuring out was there was no way that they were not going to be the ones to invent Rocket Mortgage. Why? Because they have this code of conduct. So when an intern came to them and said, hey, how come we have to kill a tree every time we get a mortgage? Why can't we just get it on our phone? They said, I don't know, kid. Good question. Yeah, go do that. Let us know how it goes, because we have no idea. Like, their managers, they really don't do much. They just are coaches to their people to walk into the office and say, hey, I have an idea. I want to do this. And they say, yeah, all right, well, it's about mortgages. That makes sense. It seems reasonable. Yeah, go do that. Let me know how it goes. Let me know how I can help. So different than the corporate cultures that I unfortunately have encountered, many of them very big, in which managers act as gatekeepers, right? Preventers of the truth. People who are so busy justifying their own job that they're not doing what they need to do, which is sit back. And I call it the executive mirror. Take in what's going on from the frontline people, the ones who, by the way, always know the truth because they're closest to the customers, and reflect that back out and make sure that that flow of information is as clean as possible. I like to say honesty is not putting more things on the fire. It's an act of omission. It's about removing bullshit. And it turns out when we remove all the shit, we can get to what's honest at the center, and it's pretty damn effective.
I was thinking about honesty versus rivalry, and sometimes they're presented as a choice. Loyalty is the word. And some, particularly now, there's a lot of loyalty in the wrong direction, and it's seen as an alternative, and in some cases a viable alternative for being honest. I mean, how do you reconcile those two? I know it's a false choice, but how do you see those two?
Yeah, I don't think we do a good enough job just continually opening up that blind spot that I talked about earlier. We have, this gigantic bias called confirmation bias, which is that if we see information that confirms what we already know is true, we just accept it right into the fold instead of asking, maybe I should investigate this further. And, before this call, we were talking about the danger of social media algorithms and how it feeds you back things you already are wanting to click on and observe and see and read. And it's really, really dangerous. It's a big problem. And so one of the biggest takeaways I want everyone to have today, the way you can put honesty into practice immediately, is to get into the habit of asking yourself two questions, which are, is that true? And how do I know? This applies whether it's a headline on the nightly news, your great Aunt Millie's Facebook post, or even an assumption, a thought you have in your head. Just stop and ask, is that actually true? And how do I know? Because unless we can get over the laziness of our confirmation bias and start investigating things, then we're never going to get out of this stuck place that we're in as a society. It falls on us to be honest and to understand how honesty and dishonesty pervades our lives. It comes back to individual responsibility for this stuff. So, but before we came on today, we were talking about, I was on Fox 32 in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and we're talking about mask wearing, right? And the question was like, how do we get others to wear masks or understand, mask wearing? Because some people want to wear it, some people don't want to wear it, and so on and so forth. And, we have to understand and get honest about how humans behave, right? You talk about loyalty earlier. Humans like to be loyal. They like to think they're part of a group and a club and a tribe, right? And the question is, well, how do you change behavior? And I'll tell you what, no one in the history of the world has yelled at someone else and told them, you're stupid and you suck and you need to change your behavior. And that person has turned around and been like, you know what? You're right. Yeah. What was I thinking? Gosh, I'm so stupid. I'm absolutely going to change right now. Like, people in the face of death who do not have the right diet and exercise, who have chronic diseases that are entirely fixable with lifestyle choices, even those people won't change their habits. What makes us think that others are going to easily change their habits? We humans don't change well. And again, back to personal responsibility, we need to become better at being in a constant state of adaptation. I talk about like being a phoenix rising through the ashes, right? And especially in business, okay? Come back to capitalism. Listen, I've been an entrepreneur since 22 of multiple companies, right? In multiple states and multiple countries. If I don't tear my business down and rebuild it, all the time, even if in my mind, something else will, either a competitor or a virus or something. Okay. So, it really comes back to what I want this to do is grab people by the shoulders and shake them and say, hey, you're a lying sack of shit. Please consider changing, because it starts there.
You were talking about the act of omission of kind of scraping away what's not honest. And it also strikes me that by putting out dishonest signals, you're attracting, more bullshit in. And, there's been lots of writing about the cognitive load of dishonesty, of just, keeping track of the face. And, some businesses seem to have a very bright line between a kind of backstage or back of the house and then the front stage and what we present, whereas others, like you've started to describe, seem to want to integrate those more. And I'm wondering how much you think that the integration or the blurring of a kind of front of the house, back of the house line is part of being honest today.
Yeah, great question. It's Eleanor, is that it?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks for being here today, Eleanor.
Thanks.
And it's a great question. So let's run through a scenario, right? Because I if honesty is the best policy, that has to work universally. Agreed? So I really set out in the book to show how it does intersect sales, marketing, ops, finance, everything, right? Including culture and even recruiting. How do we attract the right talent is a big question on the minds of companies. And the way many have sought to solve it is by installing the ping pong table in the corner. Now, I like ping pong as much as the next guy, I'm sure. But here's the thing. Let's look back at Quicken Loans or even the Ritz-Carlton, right? Let's talk about the Ritz-Carlton. How did the Ritz-Carlton go from like near bankruptcy to being one of the #1 hospitality brands, luxury hospitality brands in the world? Well, they did it by being extremely honest about who actually has all the power in their business. And by the way, it's not the executives, it's the frontline employees. They figured out, geniuses that they are, that their team of executives can't be in their hundreds of properties worldwide. It's not possible. Who's responsible? The chefs, the doormen, the receptionists, like they are the boss of the customer experience. So the Ritz doesn't hire employees, they hire leaders, and they put them through a rigorous leadership training program. And that's governed by their gold standards, which like Quicken has its isms and Ritz has its gold standards. We're picking up a pattern here. And few people realize that if you have an interaction with an employee, that employee is authorized to spend up to $2,000 to make you happy. No prior approval required. That's the amount of trust they place in the people who really matter most. Now, why wouldn't, Eleanor, that internal operation be the best recruiting strategy that you could possibly ask for? Who wouldn't want to go work there, where you're trusted and given a set of guidelines and then told, go do your job, let us know if you need help? Same thing with Quicken Loans, right? So I love this. In fact, the original title for this book, You're the First People on a Show I've Ever Told This, was actually Inside Out. Because there's this idea that once we actually create a culture that people want to be a part of, where they feel like they can go to work and actually do their job rather than do all the BS PowerPoints that nobody ever looks at, it's actually a really powerful thing to put out in the marketplace and make your marketing campaign, not only to attract talent, but also to attract customers who say, wow, that's really cool. I want to be a part of that. That's really what the Domino's Pizza story is about. They said, wow, I didn't even like Domino's Pizza or know it, but like I've never tried Domino's, but that CEO is awesome. They just went on TV and bashed their product. I want to be a part of that, right? They could have done it quietly, but what a missed opportunity not to be honest. Think about Charlotte, Girl Scout cookies. She could have just sold some cookies, but because she was so willing to be honest, somebody mentioned vulnerability earlier, so willing to be vulnerable, that opportunity cost was able to be capitalized on. Make sense?
Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah. It's powerful. It's powerful stuff.
I got a question.
Sure.
A question and a comment. I actually saw the backside of Ritz-Carlton many years ago, and you're absolutely right. They have their 14 points, and they go over 1 point, or 20 points. They go over 1 point each day.
Yep.
They discuss it as a team. The guy who picked us up from the airport from Ritz-Carlton was actually a teacher. This was his summer job. He loves working at the Ritz-Carlton. He had done it for 20 years, and it was a huge part of being part of the family was so important to him. And they did give him the ability, if any customer has a problem, They're allowed to stop whatever they're doing, whether it's cleaning a room, and they go take care of that. It might take them up to 2-3 hours to take care of whatever the issue is. Others will cover for what you're doing. This is the most important thing at that point in time. My question is this, why does dishonesty seem to be the prevailing currency on the internet or politics? I mean, it seems today we seem to have an absolute barrage of known dishonesty all over the place, and it's just overwhelming. And why does it seem to be sort of, I hate to use the word winning, but winning?
Yeah, there's two things at play here. One is folks have been inclined to assume that when you look at all the scandals, right, Wells Fargo fake account scandal, the diesel emissions scandal for Volkswagen, the college admission scandal, the Jeffrey Epstein thing, like people are like, what's wrong with everyone, right? That's actually sort of an unnatural selection we're seeing, because what's really happening is the truth is coming out more and more. And so we're seeing it more and more, right? So, you know, it's kind of the opposite. It's like those things are being exposed more, and that's a good thing. That's sort of a police in and of itself that kind of will keep people honest, I hope.
Well, like, I just jumping in there, just along those lines, just, you know, all of the videos that people capture of police interactions, you know, that never happened before.
That's
and
right.
Now we see all this stuff and we think, oh my gosh, you know, these police departments are, you know, well, it was going on the whole entire time. We just didn't know.
That's right. Exactly.
And now
right.
we're finding out all this stuff because somebody up in the 3rd floor apartment, you know, is videoing the whole thing going on down below, and you know, sort of.
I'm looking at, I agree with that, but I'm also looking at it from the perspective of, and I'm trying not to be political one way or the other, because I think I'm what I would call, I'm fiercely independent, I guess, or irrationally independent. But I see in the face of, I don't care what incident you pick, there's always somebody out there who will twist themselves into a pretzel to either try and justify whatever rationale they have. It's, you know, they want to get whatever the fact look like to fit the narrative that they have. And it seems to be sort of, no matter, you know, and I think it goes back to what you said about this, you know, shouting at each other and calling each other stupid, and you know, our ability, you know, we're sort of frozen in our original thoughts and can't release from that point, to such an extent that we're not allowed to adjust.
That's right.
And I don't know why it is that we seem to be heading down this path that, you know, the facts be damned.
Yep. So let's address that, because it's a great point, Paul. And the first chapter in my book, the title is Fraud is Our Fault. And I chronicle companies like Theranos, Vice Media, all kinds of situations in which investors poured money into companies that did terrible things, lied, cheated, stole, whatever. And the whole premise is, fraud is our fault. Like, we empower it. When we click on things, when we read things, when we share things, when we spread gossip without really knowing the facts behind them, when we blurt out to our friends all our opinions on everything instead of just shutting up and listening, that's how we perpetuate this stuff forward. That's how we make it worse. That's, you know, back to personal responsibility, right? Now let's ask ourselves, we're sitting here on a Zoom call talking about how folks are getting elected and seemingly succeeding, but also lying. And isn't that crazy, right? Do you think this conversation is happening in other places across the US?
Yeah.
Probably. So the question is, what comes next, right? We in this Zoom room can change our minds in an instant. We can't change public opinion in an instant, but boy, is it changing. We didn't even, like, we had 2 genders 5 years ago. We didn't have like the 18,000 we have now, okay? Society moves, it's moving, it's changing. And I mean, I think it's sort of on the wall that politics will change too. I don't know who the up and coming politicians will be that figure out that we need to actually start being honest and transparent with people, because what's happening right now isn't working. And I think it's a big reason why people are sort of stuck going like, I don't want either of these presidential candidates, right? I mean, how many of you have thought at least once, maybe it's time for something new, you know? And new's coming. You know, it's not here yet in 2020. Instead, we're going to have a spectacularly entertaining fall, you know, for better or worse. But the change is coming, Paul. It has to, because think about it. We're going to go down one of 2 roads. either we're going to keep lying to ourselves, to each other, to the country, and we're just going to descend into like a society of people who abandon honesty completely, or we're going to figure out that everyone's going to find the truth anyway. They're going to see the video, the soundbite's going to come out, so I may as well just tell the truth. I don't know which one's going to become true. I have hope that it's the latter, and the latter makes a whole lot of sense. But as I say in the book, and I say to my clients all the time, don't bring logic to a gunfight. It's a good way to get yourself killed. So we'll see.
Yeah,
Almost like an evolutionary choice, because really it's like, what do you want to do with your mind? Being, keep track of use all that cognitive energy, keeping track of what you're presenting to whom in different contexts, or be creative with, making better stuff.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, Eleanor. And, you think about who was the first like social media president. It was really Obama, right? Who really capitalized on social media to get elected. It was only one president ago, people. Like we're actually moving pretty quickly. It just doesn't seem like it because we're moving on the timeline of decades instead of hours, right?
So when early on, Glenn and Peter and I were just chatting. I watched last night a thing called The Social Dilemma on Netflix. It's a Netflix documentary, just came out yesterday. And basically a lot of these guys who were the programmers in companies like Google and Pinterest and Twitter and those kind of guys, their job, and this is them, all talking about it, their job was to keep you focused on their thing, whatever that was. So to motivate you to pick up the phone in the morning before you went to the bathroom, and to get, and to have you look at their thing and keep following and spending time there, because that's how they were selling advertising dollars. With your focus was their currency. So, so you are, in fact, one of the things it said is that you're the product that's being sold. So it's your attention that they want, and they know, they went to school and they went to classes at universities and all learned how the human brain is wired, what motivates us, what focuses us, what little things reward us, and that's what they programmed into all these things. And their artificial intelligence that's sitting back there on those computers is focused 100% on our antique brains from the last 100,000 years of human development. And we haven't really changed, but those computers are focused 100% of the time on getting our attention all the time. So one of the things that it does is it's looking for the next thing that's going to entertain you and get you into it, and get you excited. So it is not trying to give you all the information that you need to make a rational decision. If you say you're, on the edge of a fence, right? And if you tilt just slightly this direction, it's going to start giving you more and more things that are tilted that way. The next thing you know, 6 to 8 months from now, you're tilted way the hell over here, because your feed that you're getting is entirely different than the feed that I'm getting. Every single person's stuff is targeted to them. And Google is even, one of the guys from Google is even pointing out, is like, if you search, put in search terms like climate change, and you're in Texas, you're going to get a different set of responses than if somebody who's living in Connecticut. It's filtered. So you're gonna, so the thing is trying to, it's basically dividing us up and not giving us, a holistic view of things. And then so you add on top of that, what Peter was saying earlier about our, what did I do? Where I wrote it down. Confirmation bias. We go like, oh yeah, I've read about a thing like that already, and oh yeah, I already believe that and everything. So this is just getting you farther and farther and farther down that rabbit hole. And so you like Peter was saying earlier, you've got to stop and you've got to ask yourself, how do I know this is true? How do I know that this is real? What other corroborating facts are there? Did the talking head who just use XYZ argument to show how this candidate was completely screwed up, totally not use that same argument when he went to talk about his favorite candidate, because that argument would have blown his favorite candidate up also. You know, are people applying the same levels and the same logic and the same standards or not? And, you know, because this thing is a mess. And, you know, one of the things that one of the guys was saying is like, you know, with Twitter, with Facebook out there, you could overthrow a government easily enough if you wanted to. It's not hard, because they're all, you know, we're all, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, it's called The Social Dilemma. You should check it out. It's really good.
It's not just social media. I mean, watch the news, watch
Yes.
the headlines, watch the phrasing of headlines and of stories. Look at the framing of the way they're written, particularly political stories. Look for words people say. I mean, for anyone who watched NBC Nightly News last night, I mean, they pulled out every adjective they could to frame one of their stories in a really negative light. And they could have easily chosen different adjectives. They were adjectives, not facts. So, you know, we aren't often aware of that framing phenomenon. You know, one of the examples I use in my book is there's a big difference between, like, you know, country celebrates as troops, you know, 10,000 troops come home versus 10,000 troops coming home leaves country unsure about future. The same fact, just presented in two different ways. And, you know, it's not just the social media that's doing that. And again, fraud is our fault. You know, we need to be the ones who are aware of these devices and build some sort of BS meter, like the one I have on the cover of my book, to avoid it. You know?
Yeah. And I see it all the time. I get it, watching the news and you could tell, you know, up to a certain point, okay, yeah, you were, you know, delivering news, and then right there, you slipped over the edge to, like, you know, a bunch of unfounded things. It's
What's
like,
crazy to me about somebody who wrote a book about honesty is, like, no one's talking about that. Like, no one's, I mean, it was sort of on our, like, radar, but, like, that should be a massive story, you know? Because as you, I think it was Gavin, you or somebody else said earlier, it's like, we're not looking at all the same information anymore. All the feeds are fractured. We only have very few sources, like an NBC Nightly News, that reaches the entire country. Shouldn't those be the most objective things that pull people back to data and facts, not opinion? That to me is the story and a real threat.
Right. And that's why people just can't understand each other anymore, because it's like, how could you possibly think that? Well, they're operating with a totally different set of facts.
That's right. Yeah, people thought alternative facts was so funny. It's like, no, you have facts and I have facts. There are alternative facts. That's a thing. You know,
and
so
you know, there's definitely more data. There's more truth. There's more ways of figuring. You know, there's more information or raw data, I guess I'd say, out there, you know, available. The problem is the filtering of it, or the sense-making part that's getting garbled up.
Well, and another problem is just simply laziness. I mean, it takes time to go figure out the truth. It's much easier to believe this scandalous headline.
Yeah, because I mean, the act of journalism used to be like taking a picture for somebody who couldn't go and do it themselves. Now the act of journalism is like interpreting the data,
persuasion,
creating a table, and it's a different level of subjectivity for sure.
Yep.
Sadly,
missing the days of Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, the good old days.
Yeah,
it's amazing to me how honesty is just so absent in some departments, or in HR departments, or even management teams. You know, if you're actually brutally honest at a meeting, you get a reputation for being too opinionated, or not being congenial enough. And when you're in a corporate culture that values congeniality over results, that's even so much more debilitating.
Yep. Well, it's debilitating to the company. And the companies in my book have woken up to that. They've decided, you know what, it's not about who's right. It's not about ego. We really do need to focus on what is right. Doesn't matter where it comes from. And we're going to investigate it and figure it out and do it together. And you know, in part 3 of my book, I talk about all the ways a culture can transform, either from the top down or the bottom up, but it takes guardrails. It takes rules that help us avoid the things you're describing, because we actually live in a society that prefers kindness over honesty. You know, we operate in an environment like that. So in some ways, and this is what Ray Dalio has done quite brutally, but with, you know, $160 billion success, mind you, is broken down those barriers and said, if you're going to come work here, you can't bring your ego. It doesn't work like that. And that's why 25% of his people leave every year.
Yeah.
But the ones who stay tell him when he's wrong, and it's done okay with him. I mean, he's having a rough year this year, but we all are. But you know, you can't argue with decades worth of success.
Yeah, and he definitely laid the groundwork, you know, right away by just saying, look, I screwed up. I don't know what I'm doing. You know, I need help. I need your opinions desperately. So yeah, he's very upfront about all that.
So what do you do if you're in an organization where the people at the top just don't want to hear it? They don't want bad news. They don't want the truth.
Yeah,
they
good
want
question.
the yes men, and that's who get promoted. And
Yeah, it's a good question, Stephen.
the company's making money, but they could probably do much better. And they have the same old problems, and you know, but when you're honest, as Marna was saying, you get a reputation, or you're let go, or whatever. I mean, they just don't want to hear, oh, you're negative, you're not part of the team, you're, you know, they put together a plan. And he's like, that plan's not going to work. Everybody in the room knows it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Everybody in the room knows it's not going to work. You have private conversations off to the side. They're honest, but when you're in the room, forget, you can't say, you can't disagree with the person in charge.
Stephen, you and I must have worked in the exact same cultures. Yeah. How many of us have had that experience? Yeah. Common. Yeah. Everyone's like, yeah, me. Stephen, first of all, thanks for being here. Appreciate you being here today. And you raise an excellent point, which is, what do you do? Which is where I write a whole chapter about that. And the insights really came from two of the CEOs that led the content of that chapter. One's the now president USA of Domino's Pizza, and the other's the CEO of Quicken Loans. And they had a prescription for this, which is, one, don't do it alone. You know, don't waltz into the CEO's office or meeting and say, I know the truth and you're a bunch of morons and here's what we need to do. That's a good way to get yourself fired. Instead, build a coalition. Build a coalition of support across departments if possible, that together agree on the right solution and that bring that solution together. Easy to ignore one person with harebrained ideas, very hard to ignore a team of 5, 6, 10 people who are like, no, we really think this is a good idea and here's why. And when it comes to the why, rule number 2, bring data. Here's what's really interesting. CEOs, I can't tell you how often this has happened with me. And like, as I said, I've worked with startups of the Fortune 500. So leaders will come to us and be like, all right, we want to be different. We want to be unique. We need to really diversify ourselves from, you know, what everyone thinks. So we're unique. Okay. What are we going to do? Ooh, I know. Let's look at what all our competitors are doing and copy them. That's how we're going to be a leader. We've all been there too, right? And it's like, that doesn't make it, it's not very honest. Anyway, but what's interesting is we can actually take advantage of that mindset, which is that copycat mindset that I could never explain. I thought I was the only one in the world who thought this was weird until I did an MBA at Columbia and I got to study what Warren Buffett did. And he actually has a word for this. It's called the institutional imperative. And it describes how CEOs like to, just like a rolling stone, just like continue down their course, even if there's like sudden death at the end, right? A cliff. And so we can actually, unfortunately, use that psychology to our advantage against a leader by bringing data of what other companies are doing. The case studies in this book, there's an organization called Just Capital that puts out the Just 100, the 100 most honest, transparent, just companies out there, according to what the American public defines as being just. And they prove that they actually achieve an 8% higher return on equity than their peers by actually being more honest. So there's all kinds of data you can bring to say, hey, here's a bunch of people, we believe this thing, here's the proof, what do we do? And as the, I think it was the president of Domino's says at the end of that chapter, I quote him, if that doesn't work, and you find out that you are working for a leader who is completely blind to the truth and unwilling to abandon their ego, then it's a really good idea to go visit Indeed or Monster.com. So, you know, what else do you do, right? And I think that's where the power is. Like, we live in a time where I can pick up my laptop, and go work on the beach in Bali. We all have more and more options. And I think as people realize that and take advantage of those options and leave cultures that are like the one you described, Stephen, and go to cultures like the ones we've been talking about, more honest cultures, it will be very apparent that folks say, hey, what's going on here? We bought the ping pong table. Why aren't people happy? Maybe they'll have an awakened moment, right?
How do you find those cultures? if you are in the job search, how do you find those companies?
Yeah, I've never had to find a job, right? So luckily I've created my own because I'm a pain in the ass. Like nobody wants me to work for them. I'm going to question them all the time. So I did my own thing, which was fine. But one popular way I know many of my friends do is they'll go and look at CEO rankings. Like who are the top rated CEOs on some of these sites? Where's Inc.'s best places to work? They do a ranking every year. Many other magazines do. And that's a really good way to actually begin to think about it and set up a short list of organizations you want to work with. Here's the best part of that, right? For job seekers. What better thing does a hiring manager want to hear than, look, I'm all about culture and I realized exactly what culture I wanted. So I researched that culture and I looked up these lists and I found you and I'm reaching out to you specifically because I think I'd be a great fit and here's why. They're going to be like, oh, well, damn. Okay, cool. What a pitch, right?
It's a two-way interview process. Your goal to find in the interview process is what exactly is the true nature of their culture. Do they fully understand their mission, vision, values, and purpose as an organization? It'll change depending over time, depending on who's there and so on. So you obviously get a decision to make whether you want to vote yourself on or off the island at times. But at the end of the day, it's like dating. You decide whether you want to stay there or you decide if you want to, go date somebody else, but you need to understand who they are, but you also need to understand who you are to begin with. And if you don't understand who you are, what you like, you're bound not to find it.
That's right. Make sure you're honest about who you are.
Starts to seem like maybe the person who stays at a job with a company for 20 years and complains about them for 19 is maybe not so honest.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people get stuck. And it's really too bad because it doesn't have to be that way. There are plenty of opportunities out there. And, you remind me of something else, Eleanor, which is organizations that have been clients of mine that they put up their shiny core values on the wall, but they don't adhere to them. And that just creates distrust, right? Like I think Stephen was saying, everybody knows the truth. So, you have a company that's like, we're all about speed. And then actually they take 6 months to approve anything. What's interesting that you reminded me of, Eleanor, was that if you just said to people, one of our values is we're slow as fuck. We take forever to do anything. What's going to happen? You're going to attract people who are perfectly fine with that. And they're like, yeah, me too. I don't like making fast decisions either. It gives me heart palpitations. It's fantastic. And now everyone's happy because there's a values match.
Can we deliberate for another week? I want to really go over these numbers one more time.
Who was that, Glenn, who told us in a meeting, beware of the company that has to post everything everywhere because people don't have it ingrained. Yeah. People don't have it intrinsically.
Yeah.
Can't remember. But
as organizations that have those plaques, immediately that's a red flag of all the stuff that Peter's talking about. Yeah. Because it's something that, it's done, it's on the wall, it's real, but it's very rarely understood or baked into the culture in a meaningful way. Nope. And, hearing you talk all about, particularly Stephen's experience with, when you're working with a bunch of knuckleheads that just don't get it. I mean, that's a great opportunity to move on. And that's probably the best way to manage that because you're never going to change. Well, I wouldn't say never, but it's unlikely that you'll be able to.
Yeah.
The only trouble is I decided to move on in April. So.
Yeah. Well, you're in the right company, Stephen. Stick around.
Yeah, who's ever in charge it sets the tone for the whole thing. Unfortunately we're human beings are such great followers of leaders who's ever in charge and it change leadership and then people will just change just like that. But you gotta get a really good sense of who's in charge and then which way the thing's gonna go.
Yeah. I'll tell you that one of the saddest things in closing, which as I was just finishing up this book and submitting the final draft to the publisher, which was very cathartic, I was sitting and having a conversation with my wife and I said, what I think is most sad is that the book has inherent self-selection. The people who resonate with honesty and they get it, they're going to pick this up. They're going to love it. And the people who really need to read it, who are convinced they're already honest, they're never going to read it.
That's a great closer. Thank you, Peter, for your honesty and your wit and your endless stories about how to back it up. Just to wrap it up, I know we're on top of the hour. Next week, we've got a great conversation with Andy Posner and Kevin Egoff, who do incredible work around funding organizations and people that really need it. And I think one of their challenges, or one of their slogans, was to put the payday lenders out of business. So they have a whole suite of financial products that are going to be great news to share at next week's event. So heads up, that's coming. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's been great to just sit and chat. Find these conversations really invigorating. And thank you for your good questions, and Peter for your great answers.